mentioned earlier, I was raised in East Texas in a very conservative, really deep South kind of environment, and just sort of accepted that as the way the world was. My family was reasonably well educated, and prized education, but we didn't. My brother and I were not really exposed to very many sort of foreign ideas, if you will, and so I guess my work in this area started during the civil rights. Well, actually predated the civil rights changes, the major civil rights changes, and I was not directly involved in that in any significant way. Although, and in fact, interestingly enough, maybe not surprising, we didn't hear a whole lot about the civil rights changes that were going on in East Texas. You know, I knew of Martin Luther King, of course, but you know, all of the specific events and so forth somehow seemed to pass through East Texas without stopping to rest. And so I didn't even really become aware of civil rights history until I went off to college. And at that point, the major issue, or certainly a major issue, civil rights was still a major issue, but the Vietnam War was the issue that got me directly involved in sort of political awareness. I was fortunate enough to be in school in the San Francisco Bay Area, which was of course a hotbed of anti-war action and ideas, and it was a real interesting time period and a fascinating learning experience for me. That's really where I began to pay attention when sort of the general consensus was X. I started looking at, well, what is not X all about, whatever the issue might be, and specifically with respect to the Middle East. My wife and I went on a trip to the Middle East. Our first trip was in '91. Since then I've been, probably 10 or so times, primarily to Israel, Palestine, but also to Iraq and Jordan as well. So that's that's sort of how I got into this arena. In my academic work, I studied psychology, although not originally clinical psychology, and I decided to make a switch after I took a position up at the University of Michigan Dearborn. Decided to make a switch from more experimental areas into clinical areas, and was retrained, etc., and ultimately became interested in the treatment of psychological trauma. And so I've been doing some of that training, as well as nonviolence training in the Israel and in Palestinian areas as well. Well, the switch to clinical was actually in the 70s, and I don't remember exactly when it was, but I took training, essentially took the clinical psych training that they offered at the University of Michigan. I was able to work things out on an individual basis with faculty members there. They were very helpful in allowing me to take courses and get an internship and so forth. Now there actually exist programs for people who want to make these kinds of transitions, but unfortunately at the time I did it, there was no model to follow, so we just kind of figured out what needed to be done to get both the training that I needed and to satisfy licensing requirements and things of that sort. Well, I did one major training there on the treatment of trauma. It was a 2-week training in Israel and I'm sorry, not in Ramallah, in Palestinian areas, and in Gaza. We did 2 weeks of training in Ramallah, 2 weeks of training in Gaza, and I would estimate we trained something on the order of 50 to 70 individuals in the treatment of psychological trauma. And the training went quite well, I think. Anytime you try to set up a program in that area, there are going to be glitches because unexpected things happen routinely.
Right.
And but we were able to deal with the unexpected events and continue the training and ultimately get those participants certified according to the organizations that were sort of involved in the training.
Okay. Were the people getting trained, were they already in doing that sort of thing?
Some of them were doing that sort of thing, although they're very certainly at that time. This was in 2001, I believe, and certainly at that time there were fairly limited number of people trained in psychological issues in Palestinian areas and in the West Bank and also in Gaza. There's a very prominent psychiatrist in Gaza, Iyad Siraj. We actually did the training at his clinic, and the work at Ramallah was done through Birzeit University. Rita Jacquemin was a faculty member there, and she was the person who helped us coordinate the events and training in Ramallah. But training went well, and there has been some follow-up in the training. To tell you the truth, I don't know how extensively it's used currently. I know that both the organizations, the MDR organization and the other organizations have done. Critical incident stress organizations have done additional trainings in the area, and so my assumption is that it's being used to some extent. The issue there, as opposed to other places where these kinds of methods are used, is in the United States, if you have a traumatic situation, it's episodic. That is, it exists and then it ends, and then you can do the work. In the West Bank and Gaza, unfortunately the trauma is pretty much continuous, and the number of people, particularly children, who have been traumatized in that area is extraordinarily high. So one of the questions you had asked earlier was referred to special difficulties, and one of the special difficulties is that nobody really knows how this works, or if it can work, in situations where people are constantly re-traumatized.
Right.
But you know, there are. I'm not so much directly involved today in that retraining. I'm sort of semi-retired at this point, but there are individuals I know who are working in the area there, and so my assumption is that it's progressing at least to some degree. I wish I could tell you more. I don't have any immediate plans to go back. One of the decisions that I made, actually when I retired from my university position, was I kind of had to cut back a little bit because I just had my fingers in too many pies, and so I had to you know, kind of focus on what I wanted to you know, work on for the next 3 or 4 years.
Right.
And if anyone there certainly approached me or asked me to come, I'd certainly go in a minute. Well, the trips to Jordan, basically to observe what was going on there as well. More interesting, I guess, would be the 2 trips that I took to Iraq during the sanctions era, in which I simply wanted to see what actually was happening. We heard a lot about the sanctions and how they were really disrupting everything except the hierarchy, which I suppose they thought they were intended to disrupt, but down to very basic areas. And that's probably one of the most gruesome trips or two of the most gruesome trips that I've taken. We tried at the time to set up a potential telemedicine link from University of Michigan to various places in Iraq, and this is when Saddam was still in power, and I have no idea about how the inner workings occurred over there, but we were simply unable, stymied from setting things up. We were ready to go at this end basically, and unable to get the appropriate connections there. The reason we were doing that is that it became very difficult during the sanctions era for Iraqi physicians to basically keep up to date. Iraq had a very advanced medical system prior to the sanctions era, and not only were facilities frozen, but training was frozen as well. People couldn't get access to medical journals. There was no internet availability there to speak of, and so that's where we're trying to set up this telemedicine link, so that at least from a training standpoint, that could be more or less continuous, and people could be updated with modern techniques and so forth. Well, as I say, University of Michigan, people I talked to here seem quite interested and quite willing to pursue things, and I think we could have found funding for it, but we simply couldn't get the links at the Iraqi end. My visits to Jordan actually were primarily to visit Palestinian refugee camps. A substantial proportion of the population of Jordan is Palestinian, and was to visit Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan primarily.
Okay.
And we also went to some work collectives and so forth that existed there. There was a Arab women's, Palestinian women's weaving collective, for example, that was very interesting. Well, I maintain connections with Palestinians and Israelis. I've been unable to maintain connections with the Iraqis that we worked with. I've sort of had to go through a third party here to connect with the Iraqis to begin with, and it's just for reasons which are not real clear to me, things just sort of broke down.
Yeah.
But
okay.
it's when you're doing this kind of work in kind of tough and difficult areas, you come to expect these kind of breakdowns.
Right. Okay.
And you try to work through them as best you can. Sometimes you can, and sometimes you can't. Well, I don't know that I personally, or the work that I've done has been significantly successful. I think it hopefully has contributed to, in a small way, to what I see as a kind of a wave, not a wave perhaps, but a flow of success. I think things in general in the world are better now than they were 30 years ago. And I think maybe some of the work that I've been able to do has contributed in a small way to that. But I'm not naive in thinking that I had some sort of profound impact. I don't think I had a particularly profound impact. I've been able to be supportive to other people that I think are having a profound impact.
Such as?
Well, Hawaida Araf, for example, who is one of the organizers of the current flotilla project, that I understand, according to today's news at least, is tied up in Greece. But she was a U of M student, and she was actually a member of a group that I worked with, no longer work with, here in town, involved in Israeli-Palestinian issues. And so we had some talks, and I supplied her with a lot of material on nonviolent direct action and so forth. I don't know to what extent she has used the material that I gave her, but she's certainly doing nonviolent direct action, and I take some comfort in thinking that maybe I had some small influence in that regard. But again, these are creative, interesting people who are getting ideas and support from large numbers of individuals. And if I was able to play any role, that's fine. And if not, you know, I'm glad she's doing what she's doing, and other people that are, you know, again, very active and much more active than I in the Middle East and in other areas. You know, I've tried to be supportive as best I can.
Right.
Well, she's there in the flotilla.
Okay.
On the American ship. I think she's on the American ship. She holds dual American-Irish citizenship, so it could be she's on another ship. But Kathy is a person that I admire enormously. She's at the forefront of incredibly difficult and dangerous places.
Right.
And you know, I've tried to be supportive of her work and to at least put together venues in this area for her to get her message out, and so that's been. I look back on that with some comfort. Well, it's interesting because there are enormous forces in support of the status quo, whatever that status quo is. That's always been true. And the interesting thing is to try to figure out ways to get through those forces. In Vietnam, for example, the whole issue of the draft. If we hadn't had a draft in Vietnam, we'd probably still be fighting in Vietnam today. I mean, I say that half facetiously and half thinking that, well, maybe we would be. We've been in Afghanistan for 10 years, so why not Vietnam for 40? So it's been interesting trying to figure out ways to confront, and I think the flotilla, for example, is clearly a brilliant example of nonviolent direct action, and it's quite clear that the Israeli government is taking it as such. You know, you'll never defeat Israel using violence. You never will. The only way to do it is through nonviolent direct action, and Israel's been aware of that for at least 20 or 30 years, and they have systematically tried to break up any kind of serious nonviolent direct action projects, at least for 30 years that I know of. And Palestinians have been working nonviolently to try to change the situation there for many, many decades, far longer than most people realize. And Israelis, I think, understand the threat to the idea that many Israelis have of building a greater Israel, Eretz Israel, which would, you know, include large parts of other countries there, and recognize that nonviolent direct action is a very real threat to that image. Many Israelis don't subscribe, of course, to that belief system, but enough do that causes the difficulties that we're seeing today. Politically in Israel, the settlement political groups, you know, there are many of them, but are very powerful, and their dream is a greater Israel. I once was in a settler's home in Hebron, which is, you know, pretty contested area, and there was a map of greater Israel on the wall, and there was no evidence of any Palestinian areas whatsoever, and it was a huge country. You know, it was part of Iraq, part of Jordan, part of Egypt, part of Lebanon. So, and I asked the lady of the house in as nice a way as I could. You know, I have trouble understanding how you're going to work things out if this is sort of the goal. And she said, well, it's really more of a belief than a goal. But I didn't believe her for a second. I mean, I think that is the goal, and that's the problem, and that's something that people here both fail to recognize, and when they recognize it, they also see that they're getting money from Israeli groups here and American Jews, who are, in my opinion, a major contributor to the difficulties. Many American Jews, in particular American Jewish formal organizations. There are many American Jews that are working very hard to try to achieve some sort of stable and fair solution. Jewish Voice for Peace, for example, is involved in the Flotilla project, and so there are some groups that are involved. But this whole idea of a large Jewish state, whatever one might think of that, to practically implement it anywhere in the world is going to run into substantial difficulties, and until that idea goes, at least in terms of a physical state, you could certainly have a spiritual state, if you will, or whatever. But if you're talking about trying to implement a physical state of that sort, is we're going to be just fighting the same battles over and over and over again. I have a good deal of sympathy, frankly, with why they're doing that, because I think why they're doing that is the same reason that I, as I was growing up in East Texas, accepted segregation as just a perfectly normal. You get inculcated with these beliefs early on, and it's very difficult for any of us to, I know from my work as a clinical psychologist, it's very difficult for any of us to challenge beliefs that we hold dear to our hearts, and that we've never really looked at carefully. And that's why I think it's useful for any of us to closely examine some things that we think are absolutely true, and see does that really make sense anymore.
Right.
And sometimes it does. Most of the time it does, but sometimes it does not. Well, let me answer each of those. Bin Laden, I think, was that situation was mishandled from the very start, and I have no how should I put this in as nice a way as I can. I'm not a supporter of Mr. Bush, the W of Mr. Bush, and I think he made some egregious errors, and I think that we have continued to, unfortunately, President Obama has continued some of these policies and procedures. I think going in and assassinating someone, no matter what the difficulties might be of trying to put people on trial in a way that we have supposedly been committed to for 200 plus years in this country, I think that's a mistake. I just think that's a mistake. If you can't follow your value system when it gets to be crunch time, then what is the point in having a value system? It's not really a value system unless you can use it in hard times as well as easy times. So that's my thought about the Bin Laden situation. Gaza, it is true that the Israelis, I suspect in large part as a result of the last flotilla a little more than a year ago, has eased restrictions on getting into Gaza. But Gaza is still an outdoor prison. I would say there have been no significant changes. There have been changes.
Okay.
Nothing that's going to substantially change the situation. And I've been to Gaza several times, and the situation in Gaza is pretty grim. Pretty grim. And the surprising thing to me is not why are there attacks from places like Gaza and Afghanistan and Iraq and other places, but why aren't there more attacks? I have to tell you, if I lived under those kind of conditions, I don't think I would be acquiescing easily. So that's that's my thought on Gaza. With respect to and I don't know if this is what we're referring to, but sort of the Arab Spring idea. I like the idea of the Arab Spring. You know, anytime you have repressive situations and there is upheaval, there is the possibility for positive change. There's also, I'm not naive, there's also a positive possibility for negative change. And you know, you have to work as hard as you can to make the change positive rather than negative. But all things considered, I'd rather have Arab Springs once in a while than never to have them, and have these you know, essentially dictators ranging in their level of benevolence you know, challenged from time to time. I just happened to be in Morocco a few weeks ago on a vacation trip, and I noticed in this morning's paper that the King of Morocco has made some changes in their, I don't know whether it's a constitution or what technically what it would be called, but to give more power to individuals and the parliament. Now, my impression when I was there is that the King of Morocco is seen there as pretty reasonable and pretty moderate and so forth, but he's still a king and still a dictator, and essentially. And so I think these kind of upheavals from time to time are useful. I wonder when we might have an upheaval in this country that of significance. I thought we had one when Obama was elected, but unfortunately I've been somewhat disappointed by the outcome and by the excessive polarization, which is a you know, a structural thing in our country that we have allowed to happen, and it just makes governing makes elections easier and governing impossible. And yeah, I think sooner or later we're going to have to take a more serious look at that. I think that's long overdue, and I wish the Palestinians well, and I'm sure that the U.S. and anybody that the U.S. and Israel can coerce, like I suspect that Greece was coerced into not allowing the flotilla to sail because Greece is having serious problems of its own economically, et cetera, and who knows what kind of backdoor deals and promises were made. I wish the Palestinians well. I think they deserve a state. I think they deserve to have a contiguous state that you know, so there can be a constant flow of goods. It's a very potentially a very nice area, and certainly as far as I'm concerned, it could be the #1 tourist destination in the world. The whole Israel, West Bank, Gaza area. And I'd include Iraq in that as well. Iraq is just incredibly interesting historically. But you know, you got to get over these other kind of belief systems that are getting in the way of real satisfaction and economic growth and personal growth and so on. Creativity. They're brilliant people in those areas, and very creative people, and I would very much like to see what they could do if they could be allowed to be as creative and interesting as I know they are. Well, I think Palestinian culture is a very rich culture, and its education is very highly prized, but unfortunately, I know a friend of mine there who had a young daughter. I don't know, she's probably about 7 or 8, and she knew that an Apache helicopter, I don't know if it was Apache, attack helicopter that the Israelis used, she knew that as long as its nose was up, that they were okay, but as soon as it put its nose down, that meant it was going to fire. Children should not have to know that kind of information. Children anywhere in the world should not have to know that kind of information, and unfortunately too many Palestinian children have been traumatized. That's not to say that can't be dealt with, because I think it can, or otherwise I wouldn't do the kind of work that I do. I think it can, but you know, the easiest thing to do is to not traumatize people in the first place.
Versus,
It's
et cetera.
fear and how you deal with fear,
Okay.
and how you try to eliminate the causes of fear. There's a lot of fear in that area. Jews, with good reason, are fearful in general, and they're inculcated with that idea from early on, because of the treatment they have received from people across a long period of time. That treatment notwithstanding, I think it's important for us all to try to create a situation in which those fears are addressed in a systematic and reasonable way, and I think that can be done. And I think a lot of this other stuff, when you have competing narratives between the Palestinian narrative is one thing and the Israeli narrative or the Jewish narrative is another, and they can never really be reconciled. They can be dealt with. They can be addressed. You can set up situations so that a certain part of the narrative need not be emphasized as much. The part that causes the fear and the suspicion and so forth on both sides. But it's going to take some work to do that. And as long as people are committed to trying to solve problems through force and through violence, you got a problem. I believe in nonviolent action, not really so much from a ethical and certainly not a religious standpoint, but from a very practical standpoint. I'm comfortable here at in my home because I don't fear my neighbors. My neighbors are nice people. I know them. They know me. We help each other out, et cetera, and there's no reason why countries can't behave in that same fashion, or even political parties in this country can't behave in that fashion. But you get these polarized extremes in which no narrative other than your own narrative is considered to have any validity whatsoever, and that becomes problematic. And then one assumes that the use of force is justified, and violence, and I'm using violence in a very broad sense, not just physical violence, but economic violence and political violence and any number of other forms that violence can take. And the reliance on violence is in the long term is counterproductive, because what violence does is that it encourages, even demands that the opposition use violent techniques as well. And until you can break that cycle, you're going to have problems. I mean, I see forms of violence around me constantly in this country. Not so much physical violence. I very rarely see any kind of physical violence, but I see all kinds of economic violence and religious violence and political violence and things of that sort. And until we can get used to the idea that violence is not a reasonable way to get things done, we're going to have problems.
Right.
Not just around the world, but here as well. I'm not familiar with that particular book, no.
Okay.
Well, part of what I do in my therapy work, particularly when I'm working with couples, is to teach them how to communicate in what amounts to a nonviolent fashion rather than a violent fashion.
Right.
The basic underpinning of violence is a belief that my way is correct and your way is not only incorrect, but that you are somehow inferior to me. And it's sort of the antithesis of the golden rule, if you will. And a lot of people are willing to give that up once they realize how they're using it and how it's getting in the way of effective communication. Well, I think there's a strong evolutionary argument to be made for that the reason that a species survive is that they cooperate in certain ways, and generally a species does not survive if you have violence that causes members of that species to die. Now, occasionally there is what appears to be violent mating rituals and things like that in species, but it's rather rare for in those rituals for animals to die.
Right.
You know, and you know, later on they can potentially reproduce and continue the species. But if you've got a situation in which a species thinks it's okay to kill members of their own species, that I think that evolutionarily is kind of shaky.
Right.
So, you know,
Yeah, I remember.
pay attention to those are forces that are far more powerful than, you know, American political action, for example. The species that die out are the species that somehow lose their niche and can't figure out how to cooperate enough to maintain a niche or find a new niche.
Right.
I don't know what another niche for human beings would be other than what we have already, and if we can't figure out how to cooperate within our niche, then, you know, we're going to have problems.
Right.
You know, they're saying that the universe tends toward justice, and I think that's true. I mean, I'm optimistic in the long term, but I see lots of problems along the way, and I see, I guess because I'm more exposed to it, particularly in the U.S., you know, systems being set up that are going to perpetuate this cycle of, it's really a cycle of violence and inability to cooperate and solve problems, and you know, you can't maintain a culture doing that.
Glimmer.
Oh, yeah, I think that's one of the most helpful. I mean, obviously, like anything else can be abused, but to me, the whole idea of internet exchange and communication and so forth. I mean, for example, I could never have done this training, or it would have been 10 times as hard to do this training that I did in Israel. In Palestine, if I had not had internet capability, and so these kinds of, I think those kinds of things are very, very useful and very important. Interesting enough, I was in part of this vacation too. I was in Spain, and was with a group of people. We had a tour guide whose daughter was involved in nonviolent direct action in Spain. I didn't even know nonviolent direct action was going on in Spain, but apparently many students and others there see the Spanish political system as currently constructed, and I certainly am no expert on the Spanish political system, but see it as having a lot of corruption and so forth in it, and I just found it very interesting that they were using some nonviolent direct action there to try to make some changes in that system. I mean, normally we don't think of Spain as a country that has a, you know, particularly corrupt or shaky government, but the students and the close observers apparently do see it that way, so it's interesting.
Yeah, I'm starting to get the idea that every country has issues.
Oh yeah, I've yet to find a country I want to live in any more than this one, but I certainly have issues with, and have for many, many decades on how things are done here. You know, these are things that I've thought a lot about, and again, my approach is always from what's going to work from a practical standpoint, not from, I mean, it turns out it's interesting that the practical standpoint almost always coincides with what most people consider an ethical standpoint too, not necessarily a religious standpoint, but you know, an ethical, humanistic standpoint. So you know, I think that's the way to go. I wish that it were easier to go there, and I wish the forces that were arrayed against it, and I think not so much against it, but just that the forces that are arrayed in support of special interests were less powerful. And you know, if I were a dictator for a day, I'd make about half dozen changes, and we'd all be living happily.